Word of Cyan's growing usefulness at the battlefront reached the estate before he did, and it reached Margaret first. She'd spent weeks watching her position erode, the Duke's new attention, Cran's bruised pride, the servants who no longer looked past Cyan in the halls the way they used to. She decided, in the quiet, deliberate way of someone who'd run out of patience, that the problem needed to disappear before it reached the academy gates and became permanent. Cran didn't ask her outright to kill his half-brother. He didn't need to. A few resentful words over dinner were enough, and Margaret filled in the rest herself, hiring 6 knights through a broker who specialized in accidents that looked like bandit trouble. They struck on the forest road 3 days from the academy, while Cyan traveled with a modest escort and fewer guards than his rank technically called for. Exactly the opening Margaret's broker had promised his clients. The first knight came out of the tree line swinging for a killing blow, the kind meant for a target who wasn't supposed to survive long enough to identify his attacker. Cyan sidestepped it without breaking stride, disarmed him with a motion too fast for the escort to fully track, and put him on the ground before the second knight had even cleared the brush. It wasn't a fight, not really. It was closer to a demonstration. 2 decades of killing work condensed into a few brutal seconds against men who thought they were hunting a child. One knight broke away from the others halfway through, weapon lowered, and told Cyan flatly that he wanted no part of whatever this was becoming. His name was Brian, and something in the way he said it, not fear, more like disgust at his own employer, made Cyan let him live without a second thought. The rest weren't so fortunate. By the time the road went quiet again, 5 hired blades lay defeated in the dirt, and Brian stood a short distance off, staring at the boy who'd just dismantled a small assassination squad without raising his breathing rate. He asked, carefully, what exactly he'd just signed up to guard. Cyan told him he was welcome to find out, if he wanted a job that paid better than getting killed for Margaret's coin. Brian, to his own visible surprise, said yes. News of the failed ambush reached the estate within the week, and Margaret's carefully built, plausible deniability began quietly falling apart at the edges. She said nothing to anyone. She simply started watching her own son with a new, careful nervousness, as though she'd finally understood what kind of fire she'd tried to strike a match near. Luan Academy's gates were exactly as grand as Cyan remembered. Soaring stone arches, banners from every noble house snapping in the wind, and a crowd of first-year students trying very hard to look unimpressed while sneaking glances at each other's crests. He walked through those gates a second time, carrying none of the anxiety he'd felt the first, and all of the calculation. The entrance assessment happened in a wide, sunlit hall, where an instructor called names in order of house rank and measured each student's mana against a crystal pillar built specifically to read elemental affinity. Most results drew polite applause. A boy from a minor house hit 60% water and got a nod of approval. A girl from an old lightning bloodline hit 74 and set off a ripple of murmurs. Then it was Cyan's turn, and the hall went very quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet around someone nobody expects anything from. He placed his hand against the crystal without ceremony. For a moment, nothing happened, and a few students near the front smirked, already composing the joke they'd tell later about the Duke's forgotten son. Then the crystal turned black. Not the deep violet most darkness affinities produced. Black, total and absolute, spreading through the crystal's core until the whole pillar looked carved from midnight. The instructor read the number off his measuring rune twice before he said it out loud, and when he finally did, his voice cracked slightly on the number. 92%. The previous record, set decades earlier and repeated in Academy lore as an unbeatable outlier, was 88. Cyan had just broken it walking in as an illegitimate boy nobody in that hall had bothered to learn the name of before that moment. The silence afterward had a different texture than the silence before. Whispers started almost immediately. About the affinity, about the assassination attempt everyone had heard rumors of but nobody had dared repeat aloud. About a boy who apparently wasn't what his family had spent years pretending he was. Cyan was assigned to the Royal Hall on the spot, the section reserved by imperial order for students judged exceptional enough to warrant closer attention. He accepted the assignment with the same flat calm he accepted everything else, while somewhere at the edge of the hall, a familiar face watched him with an expression that hadn't existed in his memory of this exact moment. Ashel had come to see the entrance results in person, He found Cyan afterward, alone in a courtyard between lecture halls, and the sight of him hit differently than Cyan expected. Not fear, not even the old instinctive obedience he'd spent his first life mistaking for love. Just a cold, careful stillness, the kind a man might feel standing near a fire that had already burned him once. Ashel offered congratulations that sounded rehearsed, the same practiced warmth he'd used on senators and generals and, once, on a dying brother bleeding out in the mud. He said the family was proud, that he personally looked forward to seeing what Cyan would accomplish now that his talent had finally been noticed. Cyan let him finish. He kept his voice level, thanked him for the sentiment, and said nothing that would have given away the 20 years of memory sitting behind his eyes like a loaded weapon. But something in the moment must have leaked through anyway. A flatness in his gaze, a lack of the old eagerness to please, because Ashel's smile thinned by a fraction before he turned to leave. He said, almost offhand, that he'd have someone keep an eye on Cyan's progress at the academy, just to make sure a talent like that didn't go to waste. It wasn't a threat, not yet, but Cyan recognized the shape of it instantly because he'd given that exact kind of order himself, 100 times, to men he'd later needed silenced. He watched his brother walk away and thought, with no anger at all, that the surveillance would find nothing useful. He'd made sure of that in his first life, too. It hadn't been enough then. It would be more than enough now. Cyan had already marked her the first week of classes, though nobody else seemed to notice anything unusual about the quiet, disheveled alchemy instructor who taught with the enthusiasm of someone counting the minutes until she could leave. Sarah didn't look like much. Ink-stained sleeves, hair that never sat right, a habit of losing her own notes mid-lecture. Students joked that she'd been assigned to alchemy because nobody trusted her with anything that mattered. Cyan had known better in his first life, eventually, at a cost he didn't intend to repeat. He caught her alone after hours, in the empty greenhouse behind the alchemy wing, and told her plainly that he knew exactly what she was. Not an instructor. Not a minor noble with a teaching post. The hallmaster of the mist, the last true leader of an assassin order that had been quietly dying out for a generation, wearing a disguise thin enough that only someone who already knew the answer could see through it. Her posture changed instantly. The clumsy, distracted woman vanished, replaced by something coiled and dangerous, and she asked him, very calmly, how a first-year student had come across information that dead men had killed for less. He didn't answer with words. He answered by letting a thread of black mist curl from his fingers, the exact signature technique the mist had guarded for centuries, and watched her expression shift from suspicion to something closer to disbelief. She attacked without further warning, testing him the only way people like her ever tested anything, with a blade aimed to kill if he wasn't what he claimed to be. Cyan met her strike for strike, not holding back the way he had with Alice, matching a woman who'd spent decades honing herself into a weapon. It ended with his blade at her throat and hers at his, a standstill neither of them had actually planned for. She studied him for a long moment, breathing hard, and asked who had trained him. He told her nobody currently alive. That answer seemed to satisfy her more than any other would have. She lowered her weapon first. She told him, grudgingly, that the mist hadn't seen anyone move like that in longer than she cared to admit, and that if he wanted to prove the claim he was clearly making, he'd need to survive what came next. What came next was the base itself, buried beneath the city in tunnels that predated the academy by centuries, guarded by assassins who did not care that the intruder walking through their halls was technically a student and not yet 14. Cyan moved through them the way he'd once moved through enemy fortresses, economically, without wasted motion, disabling more than he killed because Sarah had made clear that a slaughter wouldn't prove what she needed proven. Karum sang with quiet approval in his grip the entire way, delighted by an opponent count that finally matched her appetite. The deeper he went, the more the resistance shifted from testing him to genuinely trying to stop him, until the last chamber held nothing but Sarah herself, waiting with an expression that had lost all its earlier detachment. She told him the successor trial wasn't about winning. It was about proving he belonged to something the Mist had spent generations trying to keep alive. She asked if he understood what accepting that meant. A life spent in service to a dying god, hunted by anyone who feared what he could become. Cyan told her he'd already lived that life once, and he wasn't afraid of doing it again on his own terms this time. Something about the answer settled whatever doubt she still carried. She knelt, not with ceremony, but with the tired relief of someone who'd been waiting a long time for a successor worth the title, and told him the mist was his to lead when he was ready. Eru arrived without any dramatic entrance at all, simply present in the chamber where there had been empty air a moment before. A slight, unbothered figure who looked less like a god and more like someone perpetually interrupted mid-nap. He greeted Cyan with the weary familiarity of someone who'd apparently been watching for a while, and complained, almost immediately, that being a diminished god of black fog came with far less respect than the title implied. Then his tone shifted, quieter, when Karum's presence registered. He looked at the sword like a father seeing a daughter he hadn't visited in too long. Karum, for her part, went uncharacteristically still, and something passed between them that Cyan didn't fully understand, but recognized as grief wearing the shape of relief. Eru told Cyan that a bond as deep as theirs deserved more than a blade's confinement, and with a gesture too casual for the weight of what it did, granted Karum a body. She staggered as the form took hold. Solid, human, dark-haired, furious about the sudden vulnerability of having a physical shape after existing purely as presence and steel. She rounded on Cyan almost instantly, informing him that if this new body got so much as scratched, he'd be the one explaining it to her personally. Eru, watching the exchange with open amusement, told Cyan he was already fonder of his choice of successor than he'd expected to be. Then, more seriously, he warned him that a seal bound to divine law would eventually test how far his new life could be pushed before the old rules noticed him again. Cyan didn't ask what that meant yet. He had a feeling he'd find out on a schedule he didn't get to choose. The dragon egg came from a slave trader's caravan that Cyan intercepted on a routine sweep near the southern trade road, hunting rumors of illegal mana stone trafficking that Sarah had asked him to look into. The traders themselves didn't survive the encounter. What he found in the wagon's hidden compartment did. A single egg, warm despite the cold night air, its shell a deep, mottled blue that marked it as something far more valuable than the traders had probably understood. He wrapped it in his coat without fully deciding to keep it, and by the time he reached the estate grounds again, the decision had already made itself. It hatched 3 nights later, in the small hours when the household slept, cracking open with a sound like breaking glass, to reveal a creature barely larger than a house cat, scales still damp, eyes too large for its narrow face. It looked around the room once, found him, and made a sound low in its throat that wasn't quite a cry. Then it climbed into his lap and called him Papa. He sat there for a long moment, a man who had killed more people than he could accurately count, entirely unequipped for the particular helplessness of being imprinted on by a baby dragon. Karum, watching from the corner with her arms folded, told him flatly that this was, without question, the worst decision he'd made since coming back to life. She said it while already reaching out to let the creature sniff her fingers. He named her Nana, mostly because she refused to answer to anything else he tried. She grew fast, faster than any dragon had any right to, doubling in size within weeks, developing a fierce, indiscriminate loyalty to Cyan that made her dangerous to anyone who raised their voice near him. Emily took to her instantly, sneaking her food scraps and teaching her to sit quietly during the day. Brian was less enthusiastic, mostly because Nana had taken to using him as a climbing post. Cyan understood, with the same flat clarity he applied to everything else, exactly how much danger a half-grown dragon represented if the wrong people learned about her. He kept her hidden anyway, because some decisions weren't really decisions at all, just things that had already happened to him before he could stop them. Boris arrived at the academy a few weeks later, announced as a new combat instructor with credentials nobody bothered to question too closely, given the Emperor's general disinterest in academy staffing decisions. Cyan recognized what he was within the first 5 minutes of watching him teach. Not the polished swordsman he presented as, but something older and hungrier underneath. A survivor of the Black Blood tribe, a people the Empire had spent a generation trying to erase, wearing a borrowed name and carrying a scripture that didn't belong to this century. He said nothing about it at first. Sarah noticed the same thing independently, within a week of Boris's arrival, and made the mistake of confronting him directly rather than waiting for backup. Cyan felt the disturbance before he heard it, a wrongness in the mana around the instructor's private study that set Karam on edge even through the sword's dormant state. By the time he reached the room, Sarah was already losing. Boris had shed the pleasant instructor's face entirely, revealing a presence wrapped in the dark, corrosive energy of a scripture that predated the empire itself. He fought Sarah with a brutal, economical cruelty, her decades of mistraining barely keeping pace with power that shouldn't have existed anymore. Cyan didn't announce himself. He simply arrived, Karam already drawn, and put himself between Boris and the killing blow meant for Sarah. The fight that followed was closer than anything he'd faced since waking up in his 10-year-old body. Boris moved like someone who'd survived his entire people's extinction and decided the rest of the world owed him for it, his scripture answering him with power that ignored half the rules Cyan had spent a lifetime learning to exploit. He managed to drive Boris back, eventually, but not to finish him. The instructor retreated through a tear in the mana field that shouldn't have been possible inside Academy wards, taking his scripture with him, leaving Sarah bleeding on the floor and Cyan with a healing wound across his ribs that would have killed anyone without his conditioning. Sarah told him afterward, through gritted teeth while he helped her stand, that she'd underestimated exactly how badly the Empire had failed to notice what was walking around inside its own walls. Cyan didn't disagree. He understood, better than she did, that Boris wasn't finished. Men who survived the end of everything rarely settled for quiet retreats. The Banquet of Blood happened 3 weeks later, at a royal gala meant to celebrate the anniversary of the Empire's founding, held in a hall draped in gold and lit by 1,000 suspended lanterns. Cyan attended as an assigned escort to Princess Erin, who wore the evening with the same careful, guarded politeness she wore everything else, though something had softened slightly in how she spoke to him since the battlefront. He noticed it. He didn't examine it too closely yet. The attack began without warning, the hall's grand doors sealing shut from some external mechanism as monsters that had no business existing inside the capital tore through the walls and ceiling in a coordinated wave. Screaming broke out immediately. Guards who'd trained for court intrigue, not for creatures with claws built to gut armor, found themselves badly outmatched within seconds. Cyan moved Erin behind a collapsed pillar and told her, flatly, to stay down and stay quiet. Then he vanished into the chaos wearing a mask he'd prepared weeks earlier, because a duke's illegitimate son fighting like a seasoned killer would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer yet. What followed was carnage on both sides. He tore through the monsters with brutal efficiency, Karum singing in his grip, but the hall was too large and the guests too many for him to be everywhere the danger existed. People died anyway, nobles he didn't know, servants who'd done nothing but serve the wrong meal at the wrong gathering. Fewer than his memory told him should have died. Not none. Midway through the chaos, he spotted the source, a tracking gem woven into Erin's necklace, humming with a resonance that matched the monster's erratic movement pattern. Someone had used her as bait, deliberately, knowing the attack would converge on wherever she stood. He crossed the hall in seconds, crushed the gem in his fist before it could do more damage, and felt the monster's coordinated assault fracture into disorganized chaos almost immediately. Without the gem's pull, they scattered, easier prey for the guards finally rallying around the hall's edges. By the time the doors were forced open from outside, the worst of it was over, though the floor told its own story in blood and wreckage. Lunav, who had arrived separately with her grandfather's delegation, found herself falsely implicated almost immediately. A scrap of GAM Association fabric found near one of the monster breach points, planted there by someone with far better access than the investigators realized. Cyan filed that detail away without comment. He had a growing list of things that needed answering for, and he intended to collect on all of them eventually. Ashel arrived at the scene not long after, moving through the wreckage with the practiced concern of a man building a narrative in real time. He found Cyan near where Erin still sat, shaken but unharmed, and suggested, with careful diplomatic phrasing, that a masked fighter matching Cyan's build had been seen during the attack. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was close enough that Cyan understood exactly what his brother was attempting, laying groundwork now for a story he could deploy later, whenever it became useful to have Cyan publicly associated with chaos and monster attacks rather than heroism. Cyan met his gaze without flinching and told him, evenly, that he'd been protecting the princess the entire evening and had witnesses to prove it. It was true, technically. Erin, still pale but composed, confirmed it without being asked. Ashel's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes recalculated, the same way it had after the elemental test. He excused himself with practiced smoothness, already moving toward the next group of shaken nobles to offer comfort and gather information in equal measure. Cyan watched him go and thought, with the same cold clarity that had carried him through his first death, that his brother was still playing the same long game he'd played the first time around. The difference now was that Cyan already knew every move on the board before Ashel made it. He just had to decide how much longer he wanted to let him keep playing. The dragon attack came without warning on a routine supply run near the Academy's eastern training grounds, 2 days after the banquet's wreckage had barely been cleared from the capital. Cyan had gone out alone to hunt, restless in the way he always got after a fight that left too many loose threads. He hadn't expected the sky itself to answer. 2 shapes dropped out of the clouds with the terrible grace only apex predators managed, wings blotting out the afternoon light. Lucian and Catalina, a mated pair of high-ranking dragons whose territory bordered the Academy's outer lands, drawn in by the lingering scent of demon blood, still clinging to him from weeks of feeding Karum's growth. He recognized the danger immediately. Adult dragons at that rank could level a small town without much effort, and he was, technically, still a child by every measure except the one that mattered. Lucian struck first, a torrent of flame meant to end the fight before it started. Cyan met it with a fog domain thrown up in the half-second he had, the black mist swallowing the fire whole and leaving nothing but scorched grass where the blast should have carved a crater. The dragon's roar shifted from confidence to something closer to alarm. Catalina came in low from the flank while her mate recovered, claws extended, and Cyan let Karum take the lead this time, the sword singing with an eagerness that matched the scale of the fight. Void Sphere caught the strike meant to tear through him, absorbed it, and redirected the force back, with enough violence to send the dragon tumbling through 3 trees before she recovered her wings. It wasn't an easy fight. He took a burn along one forearm that Karum's blade arts couldn't fully deflect, and a glancing hit from Catalina's tail that cracked 2 ribs he'd have to explain away later. But dragons, for all their power, weren't built to fight something that refused every rule they expected an opponent to follow. He ended it the way he ended most things now, decisively, without cruelty, but without hesitation either. Both dragons lay defeated in the churned earth by the time the sun started dipping toward the horizon, and Cyan, breathing hard, made a decision that would have struck most people as insane. He ate them, demon blood-built power. Dragon flesh, rarer and far more dangerous to consume, built something closer to raw dominance. And he'd learned in his first life that opportunities like this didn't come twice. He felt the shift settle into him almost immediately, deeper and heavier than anything the Hellhound blood had given him. Word reached the Dragon Council within days, carried by scouts who'd found the scorched clearing and the absence of 2 dragons who answered to no one. The council didn't retaliate. They investigated instead, quietly, and what they found convinced them that whatever had killed 2 of their strongest wasn't worth provoking further. It was the kind of respect that came only from fear, and Cyan understood that particular currency better than most. Alice returned to the Academy grounds a week later, back from an extended assignment with the Border Patrol, and the first thing she heard before she'd even set down her travel bag was the story everyone was telling about the failed assassination attempt against her half-brother on the road to Luan. She found Cyan in the training yard and asked him directly if it was true, that Margaret had hired knights to kill him, that Cran had asked for it, that their father had known. He told her plainly, because there was no version of the truth that would spare her the anger she was about to feel anyway. She went very still when he finished, the particular stillness of someone deciding exactly how much of their composure they were willing to spend. She confronted Margaret that same evening, in front of enough of the household staff that the conversation couldn't be quietly buried afterward. She didn't shout. She asked, in a voice gone cold and precise, whether Margaret understood what it meant to order the death of a child, and whether she expected forgiveness for it, simply because the attempt had failed. Margaret's composure cracked for the first time since Cyan had returned to that house. She offered excuses about protecting Cran's inheritance, about fears that had felt reasonable at the time, and Alice cut through all of it by asking, flatly, whether those fears were worth a boy's life. There was no good answer to that, and Margaret didn't find one. Alice went to their father next, and that conversation was quieter, worse in the way that quiet confrontations often were. She asked him directly if he'd known about the ambush before it happened. Duke Villius didn't deny it. He said only that he'd trusted Cyan could handle himself, which was true, and which did nothing to soften the fact that he'd let his own son walk into a trap rather than intervene. Alice told him that trust wasn't the same as protection, and that she'd expected better from the man who'd raised her to believe family meant something. She left the study without waiting for a response. Cyan hadn't asked her to fight that battle for him. He hadn't needed to. Watching her do it anyway settled something in him he hadn't realized still needed settling. Proof that at least one person in that house saw him as more than a useful complication. Seth Chiharkin announced his arrival at the academy the way he apparently announced everything, by putting his fist through a training hall wall and demanding to know where the student was who'd broken the affinity record everyone kept whispering about. He was a prince of Spia, built like someone who solved most problems with direct application of force, and he'd apparently traveled a significant distance specifically to test himself against a rumor. He found Cyan in the courtyard within the hour and challenged him to a formal duel without much preamble, grinning the whole time like a man who'd finally found something interesting to do. Cyan agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what a physically dominant 3-star mage with sand affinity actually brought to a fight. The duel drew a crowd larger than the academy staff probably would have liked, word spreading fast that the mysterious record breaker was finally facing a real challenger. Seth opened with a sandstorm technique rated at 4-star difficulty, a swirling wall of grit and force that could strip flesh from bone if it connected properly, clearly expecting it to at least test his opponent's limits. Cyan met it with Void Sphere, a technique rated, on paper, at 1 star, the kind taught to first years as a basic defensive tool. He absorbed the entire sandstorm into it without visible strain, the crowd's noise dropping into stunned silence as 4-star magic simply vanished into a spell that should have shattered under a fraction of that pressure. Seth stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the space where his strongest technique had just failed to do anything at all. Then, instead of anger, something like delight broke across his face, and he asked, loudly enough for the whole crowd to hear, whether Cyan wanted to go again. They did, 3 more times, each exchange louder and rowdier than the last, until Seth was laughing between attacks, and the crowd had shifted from spectators to something closer to an audience at a genuine spectacle. Cyan won every round, but Seth didn't seem to mind losing nearly as much as he minded not having anyone worth fighting for years. Afterward, sitting in the dirt with his sandstorm technique thoroughly humbled, Seth told him, quieter now, the bravado draining out, that most people either feared him or wanted something from him, and it had been a long time since someone just fought him because it was interesting. Cyan didn't have a polished response for that. He told him simply that he was welcome to come back and lose again whenever he wanted. Seth laughed, and something in the exchange settled into the shape of an actual friendship, unplanned and mutual, in a way most of Cyan's alliances in his first life had never managed to be. Neither of them knew yet how much that friendship would end up costing, or how much it would end up mattering, before everything currently building beneath the surface of the Empire finally broke into the open. The Dean found out about Nana the way most dangerous secrets came apart, by accident, in the worst possible moment. Kundal Kazel had run Luan Academy long enough to develop an instinct for things that didn't belong within his walls, and a half-grown dragon sneaking through the dormitory gardens at night to steal fruit from the kitchen stores eventually tripped that instinct hard enough to investigate personally. He found her mid-theft, wings half extended, a stolen peach still in her jaws, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then Nana, sensing threat the only way she knew how, went from startled to defensive in an instant, and a 9-star mage found himself facing down a young dragon who considered every stranger a potential danger to her papa. The fight that followed tore through a section of the garden before Cyan arrived, drawn by the disturbance in the mana field. He got there in time to see Nana take a spell that should have ended her outright, a 9-star technique, casual by the Dean's standards, devastating by anyone else's, and shake it off with nothing worse than singed scales and a furious screech. The Dean lowered his hand slowly, staring at the young dragon still crouched protectively in front of where Cyan now stood between them. He didn't ask how a boy still years from graduation had come to possess a creature capable of shrugging off 9-star magic. He didn't ask why she'd imprinted on him like family. He simply studied the two of them for a long moment, recalculating something that had clearly been building in his assessment of Cyan since the entrance exam. He told Cyan, finally, that he expected a full explanation eventually, and that in the meantime, the matter would stay between the two of them. It wasn't trust, not exactly. But something had shifted in how the dean looked at him after that. Less suspicion, more the wary respect of a man who just confirmed his instincts had been right to flag this particular student as extraordinary. He started visiting Nana quietly after that, in the evenings when the gardens emptied out, bringing small pieces of candy that he left without comment near wherever she was resting. Cyan noticed but didn't ask. Some things didn't need explaining out loud. The expedition to the Nordeli ruins came at Sarah's request, built around intelligence that a fragment of the Lemhi Haram, the demonic scripture Boris had already shown interest in, was sealed somewhere within the ruins' collapsed lower chambers, in territory technically belonging to Spia. Seth volunteered immediately, delighted at the prospect of a real mission instead of another duel, and Lunav Rainreaver joined by her grandfather's arrangement, officially there to observe and report back to the GAM Association, unofficially, far more interested in spending time near the strange mana signature she'd been quietly tracking since the banquet. The ruins themselves sat half-swallowed by sand, ancient stonework worn smooth by centuries of wind, and something about the deeper chambers made even Seth go quiet as they descended. Cyan felt it too, old, watchful pressure, the specific weight of a place built to guard something dangerous rather than simply hold it. They found the Guardian in the lowest chamber, a creature stitched together from the same corrosive black energy Boris had wielded against Sarah, ancient and starving in a way that made it lash out at anything that moved. It fought without strategy, only hunger, tearing through the chamber's remaining structure as it came for them. Lunav proved more useful than her official observer role suggested, reading the mana currents feeding the creature, and calling out weaknesses faster than either Cyan or Seth could track on their own. Seth's Sandstorm, the same technique Cyan had absorbed weeks earlier, finally found a real use here, blinding the creature long enough for Cyan to drive Karum through the mass of corrupted energy at its center. It shattered into fragments of dissolving black light, and where its core had been, a small shard of stone remained, humming faintly with the same scripture signature Sarah had described. Cyan pocketed it without ceremony, aware of exactly how much danger a piece like that represented in the wrong hands. It was in the ruins' collapse afterward that Sabalam made herself known, speaking through Seth's own mouth with a voice that clearly wasn't his, old, amused, unmistakably divine. She informed all three of them, with the casual authority of a goddess who'd been riding along inside her chosen host for years without bothering to announce it, that Seth had been carrying her since childhood, and that his sand affinity wasn't talent so much as inheritance. Seth, for his part, looked as surprised as anyone. He admitted, once he got his voice back, that he'd always known something felt different about his magic, just never anything this literal. Sabalam's attention settled on Cyan next, weighing him with an intensity that made even Karum go quiet at his side. She told him plainly that she'd heard about his conflict with Luminel's authority, and that a promise made to her now, in exchange for temporary protection when that conflict eventually came due, would serve him better than he currently understood. Cyan didn't agree immediately. He asked what the promise would cost him first, the way he'd learned to ask every god and demon who offered him something for free. Her answer was vague enough to be honest, and specific enough that he eventually agreed, sensing more truth in her caution than in any easy guarantee. It was a debt he wouldn't fully understand the shape of for a long time yet. Lunav's kidnapping happened 3 days after they returned from the ruins, executed with a precision that told Cyan immediately it hadn't been opportunistic. Fake GAM Association guards, carrying credentials good enough to pass a cursory check, intercepted her on the road back from a supply errand and took her before her actual escort even realized something was wrong. The order, once Cyan tracked the thread back through informants the mist still maintained across the city, led to her own grandfather, Ryan's Rainreaver, obsessed enough with the demonic and divine scriptures to see his granddaughter's affinity as a resource to be controlled rather than a person to be protected. She was being held in a private estate on the city's outer edge, warded heavily enough that a normal rescue would have taken hours to breach. Cyan didn't have hours he was willing to spend on it. He tore through the estate's defenses with a directness that left little room for subtlety, Karum carving through wards meant to hold far weaker intruders. He found Lunav in a lower chamber, restrained by a device fitted against her chest, a heart curb. He recognized instantly, an artifact designed to trap and slowly crush a mage's own mana until it stopped their heart outright. used to force compliance from mages too powerful to control any other way. She was pale, breathing shallow, clearly already deep into whatever slow damage the artifact had been doing since her capture. She managed a weak smile when she saw him anyway, and told him, with more humor than the situation deserved, that she'd known he'd come. He didn't waste time on reassurance. He tore the heart curb free with careful, controlled force, feeling the artifact's crushing grip on her mana shatter the moment it left her skin. She gasped like she was breathing for the first time in days, color returning to her face almost immediately as her own power flooded back unrestrained. The guards who'd taken her didn't put up much resistance once Cyan made clear how the encounter was going to end. He left them alive, mostly because Lunav asked him to, and carried her out of that estate with a quiet, simmering fury toward a grandfather who'd apparently decided his own blood was worth less than the power it carried. Lunav didn't say much on the way back. She simply held onto his arm longer than the injury strictly required, and told him quietly, once they were clear of the estate grounds, that she wasn't going back to her grandfather's house again. Not after this. Cyan didn't argue. He'd already decided, somewhere in the middle of tearing that heart curb free, that Ryan's Rain Reaver had just made himself a problem worth solving properly. Gunther resurfaced faster than Cyan expected, nursing a broken arm and a grudge deep enough to outweigh common sense, and he found his opening the one time Cyan wasn't around to close it. The afternoon Nana wandered too close to the academy's outer wall, while Cyan was pulled into a meeting with Sarah across the city. Brian had been watching her, the way he usually did when Cyan couldn't. He didn't see Gunther's mercenaries until they'd already closed in, 4 of them, armed and clearly briefed on exactly who to grab to get the leverage they wanted. They didn't bother with Nana. Taking a dragon, even a young one, was more trouble than they were paid for. Brian, unarmed and outnumbered, was easier. They hit him hard enough to put him down before he could shout, and by the time Cyan's informants in the district pieced together what had happened and got word to him, Brian had already been dragged into one of Gunther's old hideouts, bruised and bound, held as bait for a trade that was never actually going to happen. Cyan arrived alone. He didn't need anyone else for this. The mercenaries guarding the hideout's entrance lasted only slightly longer than the first nights on the road to the academy had, which was to say, not long at all. He found Gunther inside, standing over Brian with the particular satisfaction of a man who thought he'd finally evened a score. And the moment Gunther saw who'd come through the door, all that satisfaction drained out of his face at once. He tried to run. Cyan didn't let him get far. What followed wasn't a fight so much as a reckoning. Cyan didn't kill him. Brian, bloodied but conscious, asked him not to, and some old, stubborn part of Cyan still listened when the people he cared about asked for restraint. Instead, he did something he judged worse, in its own way. He stripped Gunther's mana from him entirely, a slow, deliberate unraveling that left the man alive but permanently, completely powerless. The fighting ring's most feared brawler reduced to nothing more than a body that used to matter. Gunther didn't fight back. There was nothing left in him to fight with. Cyan cut Brian loose and helped him stand, and Brian, still catching his breath, told him with a weak, pained laugh that he really needed to stop getting kidnapped on Cyan's behalf. Cyan told him, flatly, that he needed to stop being an easy target in the first place. It wasn't gentle. It was, in its own way, the closest thing to real affection either of them knew how to express. The attempt on Alice's life came weeks later, far from the capital, at the demon battlefront where she'd been stationed, with a detachment of Knights of Light. Princess Violet's involvement wasn't obvious at first. The order came through Cecilia, Alice's closest companion since childhood, a young knight everyone assumed was simply loyal, competent, unremarkable in the way of people who'd been trusted so long nobody thought to question them anymore. Cecilia had been placed years earlier, quietly, as one of Violet's assets inside the Knights of Light, and the order to move against Alice finally came when Violet decided her rival's growing reputation had become inconvenient enough to warrant removal. Cyan was at the front on unrelated business when he felt the disturbance, a familiar mana signature spiking with distress, and beneath it, something colder and more deliberate closing in. He moved before he'd fully processed why, arriving at the edge of the battlefront's outer camp, in time to see Cecilia's blade already buried in Alice's side. Alice's face, in the half-second before she fell, wasn't confusion about the attack itself. It was confusion about who was holding the knife. Cyan reached them before Cecilia could finish what she'd started, disarming her with enough force to send her sprawling, and the fight that should have followed never quite materialized, because Cecilia didn't try to run or fight back. She simply knelt there, staring at Alice's wound, at what she'd just done to someone who'd trusted her completely, and something in her composure cracked open entirely. She told them, voice shaking, that Violet had threatened her family years ago, that the order had come with no room to refuse, and that she'd hated every single day she'd spent waiting for a moment like this one to arrive. Cyan didn't kill her. He wanted to, in the cold, calculating part of himself that remembered exactly how betrayal from someone trusted felt from the inside. But Alice, bleeding and pale, asked him with her eyes to hold off, and he found himself listening to her the same way he'd listened to Brian. It was Alice's discovery in the aftermath that changed something more permanent between them. She'd seen him move, the speed, the technique, the same masked precision that had torn through the banquet of Blood's monsters weeks earlier, and put the pieces together with a clarity her injury couldn't dull. She asked him, once the worst of the bleeding had been stopped, exactly how many secrets he was carrying. He told her, finally, more of the truth than he'd told anyone else in this life. Not everything, but enough that she understood, at least in outline, that her strange half-brother wasn't simply gifted. He was something else entirely, something that had apparently been protecting the Empire from the shadows for longer than she'd known him at all. She didn't recoil from it the way he half expected. She looked at him instead with something like relief, as though a piece of a puzzle she'd been quietly assembling had finally clicked into place, and told him she was glad, whatever he was, that he was on their side. Cecilia's fate settled uneasily in the days that followed. Alice, against every reasonable argument, chose not to expose her, accepting instead her quiet, guilt-heavy loyalty going forward. Cyan didn't fully agree with the mercy. He didn't argue against it either. Word of the Holy Sword's location reached Ashel not long after, through channels Cyan hadn't fully mapped yet. Old temple records, dormant ley lines, the kind of research only someone backed by Luminel's own Saintist could move quickly enough to matter. Duran Dark, the same blade Ashel had used to kill him the first time, incomplete now that Cyan had stolen its hilt from the hidden temple months earlier, but still dangerous enough in its remaining form to be worth recovering. The Saintist of Luminel, Nephrodite Iris, worked alongside Ashel to locate its resting place, and together they retrieved what remained of it from a sealed shrine deep in territory the Empire rarely patrolled. When Ashel finally lifted the blade, incomplete as it was, something inside it stirred. Ares, the sword's spirit, revealed for the first time in this timeline as a small, childlike presence, bound to the weapon's divine purpose. Cyan felt the recovery the moment it happened, a distant, uncomfortable pressure settling against the seal on his own chest, as though the world itself had just tilted slightly back toward the shape it had taken in his first life. He understood, watching that pressure settle, that removing the hilt hadn't stopped this. It had only slowed it, bought him time he'd already spent well, but time that was now visibly running out. Ashel, wherever he was standing with that blade in hand, had no idea yet how much of his brother's second life had already been built specifically to make sure this rematch ended differently than the first one had. Cyan intended to make sure of it either way. The trail to Exilium started with bodies. Black Blood tribe remnants found drained and discarded across 3 separate villages near the Empire's northern border, each death carrying the same corrosive signature Cyan had felt in Boris's study months earlier. Sarah sent him alone, mostly because nobody else she trusted could survive what was waiting at the end of that trail, and Cyan traveled north with Karum quiet and watchful in his grip, aware that whatever Boris was building toward, it was close to finished. Exilium itself sat abandoned, a ruined settlement swallowed by the same corrosive black energy Cyan had first seen in the Academy study, spreading now across the old town like rot through wood. He found Boris at its center, standing over a circle of ritual markings drawn in something that wasn't quite blood, and the man didn't bother pretending at politeness anymore. He told Cyan, without turning around, that the Empire had spent generations pretending the Black Blood tribe never existed, and that he intended to make sure it remembered before the end. The ritual he'd been building toward completed itself moments later, tearing open something ancient and furious from beneath the ruined town's foundation. Leviathan, a sea drake of scale and legend, resurrected through the same forbidden scripture Boris had used against Sarah, its awakening roar shattering what remained of Exilium's standing structures. Cyan had fought demon kings and dragons twice in this life already, but nothing quite prepared him for the raw, primal weight of something that had been dead for centuries deciding it wanted the world to remember why it used to be feared. It moved like the ocean itself had decided to hate him personally, and the first exchange nearly ended things before they started. A single sweep of its tail collapsing what remained of a stone tower onto the space he'd been standing in half a second earlier. He didn't fight it head-on. He couldn't, not against something of that scale, and instead spent the opening minutes of the battle doing what he did best, finding the seams. Leviathan's resurrection wasn't natural. It was scripture-bound, tethered to Boris's own life force in a way the man himself probably hadn't fully accounted for in his hunger to see it done. Cyan drove Karum toward that tether instead of the beast itself, ignoring the punishing hits he took doing it, cracked ribs and torn muscle he'd deal with later if he survived long enough to need to. The demon sword sang through the strain, feeding on the violence of it, and when the blade finally found the thread connecting Leviathan's resurrection to its source, she tore through it without hesitation. The sea drake's roar turned to something closer to a scream as the scripture's hold collapsed, its massive form dissolving back into the same black energy that had summoned it, leaving nothing behind but ruined stone and the ringing silence that follows something enormous ending all at once. Boris didn't survive the backlash cleanly. The scripture, robbed of its intended vessel, turned inward on the man who'd wielded it, consuming him from the inside in a final, violent collapse that Cyan watched without intervening. It looked, for all purposes, like an ending. It wasn't. But nobody standing in the wreckage of Exilium that day had any way of knowing that yet. Ashel moved on the story within days, faster than Cyan expected even from him. He stood before the Emperor's court and presented the destruction at Exilium not as a battle against a resurrected monster, but as evidence, carefully curated, deliberately incomplete, that his own brother had been responsible for both this catastrophe and the chaos at the Banquet of Blood months earlier. He produced witnesses paid to misremember. He produced records subtly altered to fit a narrative already half-built in the public's mind since the masked fighter's appearance at the banquet. The court, already primed by months of quiet whispers about Cyan's unnatural strength, didn't need much convincing. An empire-wide bounty went out within the week, naming Cyan Vert a threat to the crown, wanted for crimes he'd actually spent the last several months preventing. Cyan received the news without much visible reaction. He'd lived this exact betrayal once before, in a different shape, and some cold, familiar part of him had honestly expected something like this eventually. What surprised him, slightly, was how little it actually hurt this time. He had people now who knew the truth. That mattered more than a court's opinion ever could. Erin found him the evening the bounty was announced, quiet and furious in a way that didn't suit her usual careful composure, and told him flatly that she didn't believe a word of it. Alice said much the same, blunter about it, offering to personally correct anyone in the household who suggested otherwise. It wasn't enough to undo what Ashel had built, but it was enough to remind him why he was still doing any of this. The convergence at Bruno happened faster than Cyan anticipated, forced by Ryan's Rainreaver's desperation to reclaim what he considered rightfully his. Both the demonic scripture fragment Lunav now carried, and the granddaughter who'd stopped answering his summons since her rescue. Ryan's came with GAM Association enforcers and a magic weapon powerful enough to level a district, confronting the group in the border town's outer streets with the wild, cornered energy of a man who'd built his entire legacy around control and watched it slip away in a matter of months. Lunav didn't hesitate this time. She'd learned enough during her time near Cyan and the others to understand her own strength wasn't something to apologize for anymore, and when her grandfather activated his weapon, she was ready with a restraint technique she'd quietly planted inside his own mind weeks earlier, during one of his attempts to force his way into her thoughts. It turned his own magic against him mid-cast, his weapon's power folding inward instead of outward, and Ryan's went down hard, defeated by the exact granddaughter he'd spent years trying to reduce to a tool. There wasn't time to process the victory. Luel arrived moments later, backed by Imperial soldiers loyal to whatever narrative he and Ashel had been building together, and behind him, finally, came Ashel himself. Dean Kundal arrived at nearly the same moment, drawn by disturbances he'd been tracking since Exilium's destruction reached the capital, and his presence shifted the entire fight's balance the instant he stepped into the street. Luel activated something Cyan hadn't accounted for, a weapon built from stolen Imperial artifacts, its purpose clearly meant to tip a losing fight rather than win a fair one. Seth and the Dean moved to intercept it, buying Cyan the one thing he actually needed: space to finish what had started with a blade in his back, years and a whole life ago. Ashel didn't bother with the practiced warmth this time. Whatever mask he'd worn through years of court appearances and careful public grief dropped the moment he faced his brother in that ruined street, and what was left underneath was something colder, more honest, closer to the man who'd once called a betrayal nothing personal. He told Cyan that none of this needed to happen, that if he'd simply stayed useful, stayed quiet, accepted the role the family had built for him, none of it would have come to a fight in the dirt of a border town. He said it like a genuine grievance, as though Cyan's refusal to die twice for his convenience was the actual injustice here. Cyan didn't bother arguing the point. Some conversations weren't worth having anymore. Ashel drew Duran Dark, incomplete without its stolen hilt, but still humming with the same divine authority that had ended Cyan's first life, and Ares stirred within the blade, small and solemn, bound to a purpose she hadn't chosen any more than Karum had chosen hers. The first exchange rattled through the street hard enough to crack the foundations of the nearest buildings. Ashel fought with the trained precision of a man who'd spent his entire life being told he was destined for greatness, every strike backed by Luminel's own authority, and for the first time since waking up in his 10-year-old body, Cyan felt the old, familiar strain of a fight that could genuinely go either way. The seal on his chest burned every time the holy sword's light grazed close, a sharp, punishing reminder that whatever divine law governed his existence hadn't forgotten the boundary he'd crossed simply by living twice. He fought through it anyway, because stopping wasn't a choice he'd ever seriously considered. Karum bore the worst of the direct contact, her borrowed body flinching each time Duran Dark's edge came near, pain flashing openly across her face, in a way that made something in Cyan's chest tighten with a fury sharper than anything Ashel's insults had managed. She told him, through gritted teeth, not to worry about her, and to finish this instead. He didn't listen entirely, but he did press harder. Aaron arrived partway through the fight, breaking past the Dean's attempt to hold the perimeter, and the sight of her running toward danger instead of away from it did something to Cyan's focus he hadn't expected. Ashel saw the opening it created and took it, a strike aimed to end things by going through Cyan and toward her at once. The Dean intercepted it, 9-star mastery finally earning its reputation, absorbing the blow meant to reach the princess, and buying Cyan the half-second he needed to close the remaining distance. What came next wasn't a technique he'd used before. It came from somewhere deeper than training, somewhere built from every death, every betrayal, every year spent believing loyalty meant something it never had. He called it, later, the only name that felt honest for something that consumed as much as it destroyed: God-Eater. It tore through the space between them, black and absolute, meeting Duran Dark's divine light in a collision that shattered every window on the street and sent both combatants staggering. When it cleared, Ashel was on his knees, the holy sword driven into the ground beside him, blood at the corner of his mouth, staring up at the brother he'd spent 2 lifetimes underestimating. He didn't beg. Cyan gave him that much credit. He simply asked, quietly, how long Cyan had known. Cyan told him the truth. Since before either of them had walked through the academy gates in this life. Since the moment a blade went into his back and a voice he'd trusted told him it was nothing personal. He didn't kill him. Not out of mercy exactly. Something colder, a decision that Ashel losing, publicly and completely, mattered more than Ashel dying quietly in a border street where the Empire could still shape the story afterward. It turned out not to matter which he chose. The sky answered before either brother could decide what came next. Light split the clouds above Bruno without warning, gold and merciless, and shapes descended from it that didn't move like anything born of the world below. Nephilim, direct emissaries of Luminel himself, arriving not for Ashel, broken and bleeding in the dirt, but for the boy who'd just defeated a god's chosen champion in open combat. Cyan felt the seal on his chest ignite properly this time, a pain sharp enough to buckle his knees, divine law finally noticing exactly how far he'd pushed against its boundaries. Karum screamed at the Nephilim closing in, throwing herself between them and Cyan with a ferocity that cost her dearly, her borrowed body scorched by contact with power, built specifically to punish things like her. He fought them as long as his body allowed, which wasn't nearly long enough. The Nephilim didn't seem interested in killing him outright. Something in their movements suggested restraint, a directive from above rather than simple execution, and the last thing Cyan registered clearly, before gold light swallowed his vision entirely, was Aaron screaming his name across a street full of wreckage and blood. Then there was nothing. No ground beneath him, no sense of up or down, just a vast, seamless dark that felt less like unconsciousness and more like being filed away somewhere the world couldn't easily reach. The Empire's version of events, once the dust settled, bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. Luel didn't survive to enjoy whatever victory he'd imagined for himself. Princess Violet, watching the chaos at Bruno unfold from a careful distance, decided her co-conspirator had become more liability than asset the moment his weapon failed to turn the fight, and had him killed before the day was fully over, tying up a loose end with the same ruthless efficiency she applied to everything else. What nobody realized immediately, what wouldn't come to light for some time yet, was that Luel's consciousness hadn't simply ended with his body. It had already slipped into Boris's restored form during the chaos, the Black Blood tribesman's body serving as an unwitting vessel for a prince who had no intention of staying dead a second time. Violet moved quickly once the throne room's dust cleared, Poison already working through her own father's system by then, a slow betrayal that had been building for longer than anyone at court had noticed. By the time the Empire finished mourning one crisis, she was already installing Boris as her personal royal mage, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, and simply indifferent, to exactly whose mind now looked out through that borrowed body. Ashel's fate, once the official story finished being rewritten, bore no resemblance to a man defeated and hauled away by divine forces. The court told a different tale entirely, one where the Empire's golden champion had died valiantly, holding back an unprecedented threat, sacrificing himself for a kingdom that would remember him as nothing less than a hero. Cyan Vert, in that same official record, became the villain who'd caused it all. The 3 years that followed happened somewhere outside the world's normal reckoning of time, inside a hidden dimension Eru had carved out specifically to buy his successor room to grow beyond what divine law would otherwise allow. Cyan trained there without rest, without company beyond Karum and the god who'd chosen him, pushing past every limit his body had carried into that pocket reality, until the boy who walked in bore only a passing resemblance to the one who walked back out. The seal on his chest never stopped burning, not entirely, but by the time Eru finally opened the way back to the world, it no longer threatened to kill him within a single day. It gave him 2 weeks now, instead. Progress, of a bitter, hard-won kind. He emerged into a world that had spent 3 years believing him either dead or monstrous, depending on which version of the story people preferred to tell, and he didn't waste any of his borrowed time on reintroductions. He had somewhere specific to be, and someone specific to find. Fuina sat at the edge of the Empire's maps, a settlement built around an ancient divine tree, old enough to predate most of the kingdoms surrounding it, home to a prophet the old stories called Hastia, mute since some forgotten curse had taken her voice, but still, according to every fragment of legend Cyan had gathered during his years in the hidden dimension, capable of seeing threads of fate no living mage could touch. He found her in a cave beneath the tree's sprawling roots, guarded by a quiet, watchful man named Mihan, who studied Cyan for a long moment before stepping aside without a word, as though some instinct told him this particular visitor wasn't the threat he usually watched for. Hastia looked at Cyan the way people look at something they've been expecting for a very long time. She couldn't speak, but something in her expression carried its own kind of communication, an acknowledgement that whatever answers he'd come seeking, she already understood the shape of the question. She never got the chance to give them. The cave's quiet shattered as gold light tore through the entrance, the same merciless brightness that had swallowed Cyan whole at Bruno 3 years earlier. Nephrodite Iris, the saintest of Luminel, stepped through it with Nephilim at her back, and an expression that suggested she'd been waiting just as long as Hastia had, though for an entirely different reason. She didn't waste time on words. She moved for Hastia directly, and Mihan threw himself into her path, buying seconds against an opponent so far beyond him it barely registered as a fight at all. Cyan lunged forward, Karum already singing, but the Nephilim closed around him faster than he could clear the distance, gold light and divine weight dragging at every motion he tried to make. He caught one final glimpse of Hastia's face. Not fear, something closer to resignation, as though she'd always known this moment would come, and had simply hoped for a little more time, before the Saintest's hand closed around her, and the world dissolved into another swallowing flash of light. Mihan collapsed to his knees, breathing hard, staring at empty space where the prophet had stood only seconds before. Cyan was still fighting his way through Nephilim that didn't seem interested in retreating this time. The seal on his chest already burning with the countdown he knew was ticking somewhere beneath his ribs, and somewhere above him, gold light carried away the one person who might have finally told him what came next.